A reading from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 3, verses 1 through 20. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." He said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and laid down. The Lord called again, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called to Samuel again a third time. And he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you have called me." Then Eli perceived that it was the Lord that was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and laid down again in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from the beginning to the end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever." Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli said to Samuel, "Samuel, my son." He said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What is it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all that he had told you." So Samuel told him everything, and he hid nothing from him. And he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what he seems good to him." As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. This is the story of the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Ezekiel hasn't been sleeping well. Well, he's never slept well, but it's just gotten kind of worse. When he was little, it was kind of cute. The little guy would cry, and he would go, and you would cuddle him, and you would rock him, and it would take a couple hours, but it was quality time, cuddling with my son. Now that he's almost 2, there's just a lot of kid there. It's a little bit more awkward. There's squirming, there's jumping, there's flopping, there's fussing. There is an excessive amount of accidental face kicking and throat punching that happens in the night. My face and throat, for the record. So when I read the Hebrew Bible passage for today about the call of Samuel, I thought to myself, "Lord, if you are calling my son to be a prophet in the middle of the night, can you use one of the different prophet call stories? The original Ezekiel, all he had to do was eat a giant scroll. Give my son a scroll and let me sleep." Now, I understand that the Jonah call story would be kind of difficult. It'd be very hard to get a giant fish to swallow him when we live in a landlocked state. I get that, but there are so many other prophetic calls that you could choose from, Lord. If you remember, when God calls a prophet, it's generally a traumatic experience, ranging from serious dread and doubt with Jeremiah to taking a hot coal from a burner and putting it in Isaiah's mouth. The call story for today is kind of in the middle, an insomniac child. But beyond the call, the job of a prophet is much more difficult. Just to do a quick recap, being a prophet and saying prophecy isn't future telling. A prophet isn't here to shake their magic 8-ball and say what's going to happen tomorrow. No, a prophet's job is to speak truth to power. In the case of Samuel, his job happens young, and it happens like that. God calls to him in the middle of the night, and he wakes up and he thinks that his mentor was calling him. Samuel was the son of a woman named Hannah. Hannah was barren for most of her life until she went to the temple every day to pray and said, "God, if you give me a son, I will dedicate him to your temple, to the service of your priest and judge Eli." So Eli had been raising young Samuel. God with his mentor. I was old and couldn't see very well, so it took him a little bit to catch on, but eventually he realized that Samuel was being called to be a prophet by the Lord Most High. So when Samuel responded, "Here I am," he heard his first prophecy. He heard his first duty as a prophet, and that is to prophesy against the man who had raised him. That's some rough stuff. The job of the prophet is to speak truth to power, no matter who is in power. Throughout all the rest of Samuel's life, Samuel would be called to anoint kings, then prophesy against those kings. He would lift up Saul just to declare Saul's downfall. He would lift up David just to preach against David later on when they go astray. The prophet's job is not to pick favorites. The prophet's job is to have that hard conversation. Needless to say, prophets didn't usually live a life of peace and happiness. No one likes to hear that they've been wrong. But God says that that is part of our Christian duty, part of our faithful duty is to prophesy, to speak truth in times that are difficult. Do you know anybody who prides themselves on telling it like it is? They'll tell the truth. They don't care who they hurt or how many people they offend. No, they are just straight shooters. Those people are not prophetic. Mostly they're just rude. A lot of times the truth that they share are just mean thoughts that they've had that they want to get out of their system. Now, God bless those people, and God bless the people who put up with us like that, way more than we deserve, but that's not the spirit or nature of prophecy. Now, a prophet speaks in love. God moves them to speak out against a great injustice, a great sin, against the people that they care about. If you look at the life of Samuel, every person that he prophesies against, he has a very strong, very loving relationship with. He grieves the fact that he has to prophesy. He grieves unto his own lament and death that his relationship with Saul had been so sacrificed. That he had picked Saul, that he lifted up Saul, that he had worked with Saul, and to see that Saul had fallen from grace so much that it hurt him deep inside. He took no joy in prophesying against Saul. And just like in the passage today, that little boy did not want to share the bad news with his mentor. He did not want to hurt the person he loved so dearly. But God moves the prophet to speak in love. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book Life Together, that we're going through in a Zoom study right now, he describes it kind of like this. He says that in our life together, we need to be connected to Christ first, and through Christ, each other. Rather than being connected to each other, then to Christ when we get around to it. Meaning, I shouldn't think of my brother and sister in Christ as a friend first, then a fellow Christian second. Because when we focus on that friendship or family connection, we tend to value that human connection more than our prophetic obligation. We dislike conflict in the church. We don't like having conflict. None of us do. But so often that conflict avoidance lets problems fester, lets the problem really dig in and take root until it affects the entire community. Bonhoeffer's solution to that is, if you focused on Christ, you can say those words in love, and you can fix the problem. And on the reverse end, if you focus on Christ, you can hear those words and address the problem. We see an excellent example of that today in today's reading. Samuel, who dreads this news, Samuel, who doesn't want to share this, hears the words of his mentor Eli and say, Samuel, whatever God has told you to say, you need to say it, because it's going to be worse if you don't. And when Samuel shares the news that Eli and his house have lost favor, that they're going to fall, Eli takes it with a lot of grace himself. When we are connected to Christ first, then to each other, not only are we empowered to prophesy, we are empowered to self-reflect. It's all about building that central relationship with Christ so that way we know when to speak, that we know how to act. But that's the thing, God calls us to act. There's no better example of that than Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose holiday is tomorrow. So in celebration of his holiday, I want to talk a lot about his work in the letter from the Birmingham jail. This is one of his greatest pieces that really speaks to us 57 years after it was written. Set the stage for this letter, I just want to put it in context. On April 12th, 1963, Dr. King and his organizers were going to have a march in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, the magistrates and the city council of Birmingham put an injunction in place to bar him from having this demonstration because they worried that there would be violence if they marched. Now, the violence did come when they marched, but it came from the counter-protesters and it came from law enforcement. The marchers themselves practiced a very passionate acts of nonviolence and received the beatings. And then Reverend Dr. King and 50 of his fellow demonstrators were arrested. The following day, 8 white clergy leaders, including 2 Methodist Episcopal bishops, wrote a letter condemning the act, saying that this is the act of outside agitators, that these are the acts of extremists looking to instigate violence in their community. While sitting in jail, Dr. King took the time to write out a long letter, and I posted a letter on my Facebook page, and we have copies in the office if you want to read the letter in its entirety. But it's a powerful, powerful statement to the prophetic calling of our faith. He starts out by acknowledging the position, the earnest position that these white clergy were in, that they were worried about violence in the streets. But he also paired that with the reality that violence is happening in the homes of the African American. That after centuries of oppression, after centuries of neglect, the tensions in the country had built to a point where violence was going to happen if they didn't have a creative outlet. So how could a person, an oppressed person, express their dissatisfaction in a way that the people who are unaffected or the people who are propagating the oppression would ever find acceptable? This is something that we hear over and over and over again. The people who are in power or the people who are unaffected always complain about the inconvenience of a prophetic statement. We don't want to hear how we have fallen short. We don't want to hear the radical nature of Christ's calling for us. We want to hear our same songs on Sunday. We want to hear the prayers said from up front. We don't want to hear the cries of those in need. So Reverend King wrote his white clergy colleagues and expressed his methodology. That's what I love about the letter from the Birmingham jail, is that he details the process. He details their purpose. The I Have a Dream speech is a really powerful, really moving speech, but if you want to know what Reverend King did, what he did, how he did it, and what his goals were, this letter gives you such amazing insight. And just as the letter from the white clergy gives you such amazing insight on what he was up against. In this letter, Reverend King talks about how the true enemy of progress isn't the Klansman. It isn't the white supremacist. It's the moderate. It's the people in the middle who have sympathy but not motivation. Who hear the cries, they see the injustice, but at the same time, they are too comfortable to take action. And then when their attentions are drawn to the problem, when they are forced to address the situation through inconvenience, because Reverend King, he made himself quite inconvenient. They would do sit-ins at segregated restaurants. They would come in mass and they would sit at the counter so that way business had to stop while they were physically removed. They would have sit-in at churches. And again, the concept of segregated church blows my mind, but they would sit in at churches and worship would stop until they were, again, physically removed from church. Man, when our doors open again, I will never, ever, ever physically remove anyone who come in earnest, who come truly to worship. So this is Dr. King's prophetic call. To claim the spiritual necessity to act, to resist the forces of evil, to resist the forces of injustice, to resist the forces of oppression. If those words sound familiar, it's from our baptismal creed. We talked about it last week. Reverend King was speaking to his fellow clergymen and telling them that the power of the church comes through direct action. The power of the church comes through the prophetic calling of our Christians. The power of the church isn't there to smooth things over. The power of the church isn't there to maintain the status quo. The church is at its best when we're disrupting the worst parts of our society. But we're comfortable. We like what we do. We don't want to shake things up because we are too connected to each other through direct relationship rather than connected to each other through a Christian relationship. And that's not bad, at least not entirely. But Samuel and Eli will tell us that your connection to God is more important. Reverend Dr. King would tell us that our prophetic calling through Christ is more important. So as we go forward in this really complicated, really strange world we live in, we have to listen. We have to listen to what God is calling us to do. We have to listen to what the church is calling us to do. The United Methodist Church is all about repenting from our past sins. There is a very complicated relationship of Methodism and racism. Back in the early 19th century, we actually had a church split over the ownership of slaves. In the Book of Discipline, it said that we cannot own slaves, and a Southern pastor married a woman, and his wife owned slaves, so he was brought up on charges, which caused a split between the Methodist Episcopal Church North and Methodist Episcopal Church South. They wouldn't get back together for over 100 years. And even when we did, we had racially segregated conferences. We look back on this history with open eyes and open recognition that two of our bishops signed that letter to Reverend King. So as we move forward, we recognize the errors of our past in hopes that when we hear the words of the prophet again, we are going to respond like Eli responded. So that way we can be in relationship with Christ to our neighbor to work towards that sense of justice. Just a quick warning, in the next piece, I actually read directly from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, and I read it as written. There are a lot of words in here that I would never use in everyday talk, but that was the language of the time, and I ask that you hear past those words to the truth that Reverend Dr. King was talking about. In closing, I want to honor the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. by talking about the problem of extremism our country is currently facing. We have seen a massive rise in violent hate crimes over the past several years. We haven't seen this level of hate crimes in over a decade. For the past 3 years running, we have seen more than 7,000 violent attacks against women, minorities, people of color. This is a huge spike. And we can talk about whose fault it is or what's worse and point fingers and blame, but we have to realize that many of our men are being radicalized, that they're hearing false information, that they're giving into conspiracy theories, and that's turning them towards violence. Extremism of all forms can be deadly. It doesn't matter if it's left-wing extremism or right-wing extremism. Not to equate the two, one has definitely been more active in recent years, but both types are dangerous. And we cannot face extremism with a call for unity, like the white clergy did back in the 1960s. We have to meet extremism with extremism of our own, a radical, loving kind of extremism. To finish up, I just want to read a passage directly from the letter from the Birmingham jail. This passage really changed how I view the world and my views of ministry. It really shaped who I am. But on this question of extremism, this is the solution that the good Reverend Doctor provides for us. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what happened to the American Negro. Something within him reminded him of his birthright, of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up in the zeitgeist, and that his black brothers of Africa and his own brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency towards the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations. He must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in a nonviolent way, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this is normal and healthy discontent, and it can be channeled into creative outlets of nonviolent, direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, I continued to think about the matter, and I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was Paul not an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of Lord Jesus. Was Martin Luther not an extremist? I stand here, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. Dear friends, go forth. Go forth in love. Go forth with your prophetic call. Go forth and be an extremist for our Lord Jesus Christ.